Hello, and welcome to the Cryptocurrency News Channel. Today we're going to talk about Hedera Hashgraph. We're going to talk about some of the underpinnings of Hashgraph. It's going to be like a brief overview of the technical aspects and how Hedera Hashgraph is different from blockchain. Now, if you actually look at their white paper, which I will actually link as the first comment that's pinned, they actually talk about the difference between Hashgraph and blockchain, but only really proof of work blockchain, and how Hedera Hashgraph doesn't actually have blocks. Each transaction is confirmed by previous transactions, and how Hedera Hashgraph is actually efficient. So it is a third generation public ledger. In contrast to blockchain technology, Hedera Hashgraph uses DAG, which is directed acyclic graph, as an underlying technology. And IOTA, Nano, and Tixel actually use about the same thing. Whereas blockchains rely mostly on proof of work as a consensus mechanism. Now that's not true because there's now proof of stake, proof of authority, and all those other things. But their explanation generally focuses on the difference between proof of work and directed acyclic graph. So instead of proof of work as a consensus mechanism, and that basically has its drawbacks because they're really energy hungry and they require miners to solve difficult cryptographic puzzles. In DAGs, the network participants act as nodes, which cross-validate each other's transactions. Therefore, DAGs scale with the number of network participants instead of how much mining power you have. The more network participants you have, the faster the transactions can actually be validated. It is kind of like the same concept as IOTA, but as opposed to IOTA, because IOTA uses a centralized coordinator, and actually IOTA is trying to remove that centralized coordinator via Corticide, and that's a big project by IOTA. I don't think they've done it yet because they're still having some issues. Hedera uses a gossip protocol and an asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerance, ABFT, as a consensus mechanism. With a gossip protocol, nodes exchange data with other nodes in the network in a very fast and efficient way. The use of the gossip protocol automatically builds a hashgraph data structure from which the project derives its name. AFBT, on the other hand, requires 2/3 of the network nodes to confirm a transaction, and that's a mechanism which their founders actually thought up. Hedera Hashgraph boasts itself as a very fast distributed ledger where transactions reach finality within 3 to 5 seconds. That is pretty much in line with like other really fast consensus mechanisms like Ripple, Nano. I think Nano is slightly faster, but no one's really going to care between 3 and 3.5 seconds. But the through output will be limited to 10,000 transactions per second in the beginning. Now that is actually quite a lot more transactions than most other blockchains right now. Ripple is about 1,500. I don't exactly know how much Nano is, but 1,500 is kind of like one of the best for current blockchain or blockchain DLT mechanisms. But 10,000 is way above that. Of course, you can do off-chain solutions at way more than 1,500 on the off-chain solutions for way more than 1,500 transactions per second. But that's kind of a different solution. Like Lightning basically can transact enormous amounts of transactions for Bitcoin, but again, that is an off-chain solution. If you want to reconcile on-chain and settle, you still have to go through the slow process. So Hedera Hashgraph is limited to 10,000 transactions per second on-chain. That's not really a limitation because nothing even comes close to 10,000 transactions on-chain. But as the network matures, higher TPS will be allowed. In addition, Hedera states that the average transaction fee will be around 0.0001 pennies, well below Bitcoin's typical average of about 20 cents. Now, they're giving themselves like huge leeway because they're comparing them to Bitcoin, which is the oldest and probably most costly of the blockchain technologies. If you compare it to Ripple, some of the other proof-of-stake coins, it's not nearly as much. Of course, Hbar is the token that powers the ecosystem, and we all know about Hbar. There's a total of, they raise a total amount of $124 million, a total of 379 million tokens were sold, with an additional 1.5 million tokens that went to advisors and partners. The total supply of Hbar is capped at 50 billion, and they plan to release the 50 billion over 15 years in the ecosystem. So there will be inflation on the supply of Hbars over the next 15 years. They're already listed on 12 exchanges. So that's basically how they're distributed the technology works. It is a DLT technology. It's not blockchain in the proof of work sense. They actually have nodes and validators to confirm transactions. It actually does sound sort of like proof of authority, but not completely. And IOTA, Nano, and Tixel kind of work the same way, although IOTA does rely on a centralized coordinator. So that's like a brief overview of how the DAG works. So, like I said, it's already used in a couple of well-known cryptocurrencies. Byteball and IOTA utilize this different form of distributed ledger technology, which offers slightly different advantages. Now, will this actually replace blockchain? It might replace blockchain in terms of proof of work, but I don't think it's going to replace the other types of consensus mechanisms in blockchain. Obviously, it beats proof of work in scalability and transaction fees, but so does, every other cryptocurrency. It beat Bitcoin in terms of scalability and transaction fees. With DAGs, there is no concern whatsoever of overloaded blocks and slow transaction speeds, and the transactions simply follow after one another. Additionally, a big issue with some of the smaller blockchains has been a threat of a 51% attack. When it comes to DAGs, the lack of mining power and the lack of blocks altogether means that there cannot be an attack of this nature. And because the transaction order is spread out already, attempts at double spending will be caught and rejected immediately, as there is already spread through the network. So basically, like a majority of the validators have to validate the transactions, and if there's some kind of some kind of hack or attempted takeover, most of the validators will actually reject it. So you can't actually double spend or hack it. In theory, you can't do that. All sounds quite promising for a new generation of blockchain, alleviating the main problems of the last 10 years. Of course, Antonopoulos doesn't completely believe in it, and he actually brings up a couple of problems that this even younger technology has when it comes to core values as a distributed ledger. Lack of resilience. Now, this is a problem that could actually be solved over time, because obviously if this new technology has just surfaced, there's not been much time to actually prove of it. And he says, I don't think DAGs, Tangles, which is IOTA's thing, or other formulations can replace proof of work decentralized blockchain. That is because proof of work brings specific and valuable characteristics that cannot be achieved with other consensus algorithms. At least no one has been able to demonstrate its scale at achieving with those other algorithms. I don't really know if that's true, because I do think like there are proof of stake coins that have demonstrated some kind of resilience. There are also like proof of authority coins like Ripple. And I think this directed acyclic graph with IOTA, Nano, and Tixel, as soon as they're adopted by some industries, they will actually prove it as well. There's going to be some problems along the path, as like with all technological information, there is going to be some problems along the path. But I think eventually, like, they will go beyond what proof of work does, because proof of work is incredibly power intensive. So Antonopoulos also expresses concerns about the centralization and censorship to which DAGs can be subject. Immutability is a big issue here. The ability to change history without anyone noticing, or without the current entrance into the network being able to detect a false history from a true history. But I mean, it still has to be validated by the network nodes and validators. But more broadly, I think proof of work with anonymous participants in an open, decentralized network makes a cryptocurrency very resilient to coercion and controlling regulations. The thing is, with proof of work, all the mining pools are basically in China, so there is some kind of concern with that, where the Chinese government can actually do a 51% attack fairly easily and take over the network. And he thinks those, Antonopoulos thinks those are very, very important capabilities of the anonymous participants. So, I mean, he's arguing against this DAG thing, but I honestly think like other technologies, including DAG, will actually overtake proof of work. Proof of work was like the first generation, and the only ways to solve like the problems with bigger blocks and stuff is with transactions, is with like either like more blocks per second or slightly bigger blocks. But as Bitcoin SV has demonstrated, bigger blocks carries with its own problems, like reorgs and things like that. So essentially, I do think they will actually have to go with this method sooner or later, because I do believe IOTA will work pretty well as soon as they remove the centralized coordinator. DAG doesn't really have a centralized coordinator, so they don't really have that problem. But there have been people saying that DAG can't actually achieve 10,000 transactions per second. And they have a point, because it's really never been stress tested all that much, not in real life anyways. None of the applications today reach anywhere near 10,000 transactions per second. Obviously, if we look at the performance of the Hashgraph distributed ledger, it's inexpensive to operate compared to blockchain distributed ledgers, as it avoids energy-intensive proof-of-work blocks. That's been stated several times, but once again, not all blockchains are proof-of-work now. Individuals and organizations who want to run Hashgraph nodes will not need to purchase expensive custom mining rigs, obviously. Instead, they will be able to run Hashgraph nodes via readily available hardware that is less expensive than such specialized mining rigs. Hashgraph is 100% efficient, as that term is used in the blockchain community. In blockchain, work is sometimes wasted mining a block that later is considered stale and is discarded by the network of nodes. In Hashgraph, the equivalent of a block of transactions never becomes stale. Hashgraph is also efficient in its use of bandwidth. Whatever the amount of bandwidth required to inform all the nodes given a transaction, Hashgraph adds only a very small overhead to additional bandwidth to achieve consensus timestamp and put the transactions in order. Additionally, Hashgraph voting algorithm does not require any additional messages to be sent in order for the nodes to vote on validating transactions. So technically, the transactions per second and the through output of Hashgraph is only limited by bandwidth. And if each network node has enough bandwidth to download and upload a given number of transactions per second, the network as a whole can handle close to that many transactions per second. So the more bandwidth that each node has, the more transactions per second that Hashgraph has itself. And that's a much better way of scaling than proof of work generally. And then in the white paper, they have following charts of performance: how many transactions Hashgraph can achieve based on both latency, and latency is calculated anywhere on these graphs from half a second to 10 seconds. So regardless, even at its worst, it's really fast, and it goes all the way up to 128 computers and 400,000 transactions per second. So, and it goes through the more nodes you have in the network, the more transactions per second you can actually process. So it goes through security as well, cryptography, and asynchronous Byzantine fault storage. Hashgraph itself composes of generally three things. And those three services are cryptocurrency with Hbars, smart contracts, obviously, and file services. So the file service is where external data can be anchored on the public ledger. By creating hashes of a document, the purpose of a file service is to manage credentials and to verify that data existed at a certain time with a fair timestamp. So essentially, it's got the three services. I think the file storage will be fairly popular. Obviously, smart contracts are going to be widely used once projects actually come down to Hashgraph. And cryptocurrencies via Hbars, I have a few questions about the pre-sale price and all that stuff. But generally, the technology behind Hashgraph actually sounds pretty good. We know it's actually being used in other projects like IOTA Nano and Tixel. But of course, each one of those projects implements it in a different way. So I do think DAG, which is directed acyclic graph, is actually one of the ways to actually use DLT in the future, and it looks like to be much more efficient than the old proof of work ways. But then again, you have to compare it to the newer the newer things, like proof of stake or proof of authority rather than proof of work, because proof of work is one of the most inefficient ways to actually run a blockchain these days. So that is the news for today. Hope that informed you a little bit on Hedera Hashgraph. And thank you. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you and have a nice day.